Ilara collapses, humiliated, as the merchant shames her for rotten apples. Her starving children watch. "No one starves again," thunders a voice. The mountain man emerges, a detail in his gaze hinting at a power beyond this town. What he does next changes everything. The harsh wind of winter bit deep into Havenwood, chilling not just the flesh, but the very spirit of its people. A silent, insidious hunger had crept into the small mountain town, gnawing at the edges of every hearth. But none felt its icy grip more profoundly than Ilara. She was a woman etched by hardship, a widow whose very being had become the sole bulwark against the yawning maw of starvation for her two small children. Months ago, the treacherous depths of the mine had claimed her husband, leaving her adrift in a sea of grief and want. Now, the cold indifference of the town's merchants presented a new, more insidious peril. The once sympathetic gazes of her neighbors had curdled into a cold, whispered judgment. Their pity, a fleeting comfort, had dissolved into a dismissive wave, painting her as a burden, a reminder of the fragility they all feared. The subtle ostracism, the averted eyes, the closed doors, each a quiet condemnation that pressed upon her spirit, slowly eroding her pride. She had always prided herself on her resilience, her ability to make do, to find a way. But the children's hollow cries, their small bellies concave and their eyes mirroring the endless winter sky, pushed her beyond the bounds of what she thought she could endure. One biting morning, driven by a desperation that screamed louder than any winter gale, Ilara found herself by the back door of the general store. The air hung heavy with the scent of pine and the distant promise of snow, but her focus was on the discarded barrel near the refuse pile. Within it lay the merchant's refuse, apples shriveled and bruised, some with patches of rot, yet still holding the faintest hint of sustenance. With trembling hands and a heart that pounded like a trapped bird, she had scooped a handful into her tattered apron, the cold, yielding flesh a testament to her profound, humiliating need. It was an act that tore at the fabric of her very being, a forced surrender of her dignity for the meager hope of silencing her children's hunger. But the merchant, a man whose avarice extended even to his waist, had a keen eye for what he considered his. His voice, sharp and accusatory, sliced through the quiet morning air, echoing across the frozen square as he cornered her, the rotten apples scattered at her feet like emblems of her shame. Each shouted word, each pointing finger, stripped away another layer of her composure, exposing her vulnerability for the entire town to witness. The few passers-by slowed, their expressions a mix of condemnation and morbid curiosity, their whispers a chorus of righteous indignation. They saw a thief, a fallen woman, not a mother battling the relentless tide of starvation. Yet in their collective judgment they overlooked a deeper truth woven into the very fabric of Havenwood. For generations the town had taken from the mountains, its timber, its ore, its silence, but given little back, especially to its own. The merchant's prosperity, and indeed the town's perceived stability, was built upon a fragile, often cruel, disregard for those who fell from grace or simply fell on hard times. Ilara's plight was not just her personal tragedy. It was a mirror reflecting the town's own stark indifference, a silent testament to how quickly compassion withered when faced with inconvenience. The townsfolk clung to their meager comforts, their small deceits, never truly seeing the desperation they helped to cultivate. It was in this crucible of public humiliation, as the weight of an unforgiving world threatened to crush her utterly, that a shadow detached itself from the edge of the surrounding forest. A towering figure, draped in the rugged hides of the wild, emerged from the tree line. He was Jasper, known only in hushed tones as the Mountain Man, a legend whispered around campfires, a phantom whose very presence spoke of untamed wilderness and laws older than any man-made decree. He was the stark antithesis of Havenwood's fragile civility, a bearded giant, whose eyes held the silent, ancient wisdom of one who understood the true measure of a life and the true cost of survival. His unhurried approach, his powerful stride, was a stark herald of change, promising that the fragile world Ilara knew was about to be irrevocably altered, for better or for worse. The silent mountains had sent their messenger. The mountain man's arrival was not a whisper, but a stillness that fell upon the square. His massive frame, clad in rough-hewn leather and thick furs, seemed to absorb the petty clamor of Havenwood, his very presence an ancient challenge to their shallow judgment. Jasper had journeyed down from the peaks, as he did a few times each year, to trade his carefully cured pelts and rare mountain herbs for the few necessities his self-sufficient life required. Powder for his rifle, lead for casting, a handful of sturdy tools. He came not for companionship, nor for the paltry gossip that passed for news, but for the stark practicality of survival. He often watched the townsfolk with a quiet intensity, observing their intricate dance of commerce and superficial pleasantries, a world so far removed from the brutal honesty of the wilderness he called home. He saw their fear disguised as morality, their greed cloaked in respectability. Now, his gaze, usually distant and assessing, sharpened. It settled upon Ilara, huddled and broken before the merchant, and then swept across the faces of the onlookers. He did not see a thief as they did, but a primal force, a mother driven to the very brink by a primal need, risking everything for her young. He recognized the stark, untamed desperation in her eyes, a reflection of the same raw struggle he faced daily against the mountain's indifferent might. The sight resonated deeply within him, stirring a quiet fury at the town's collective failure, their hollow piety. They, who professed charity and community, had allowed one of their own to reach such an abject state of need that she would steal what they deemed worthless. It was a betrayal of a fundamental law far more egregious than the theft of rotten fruit. Without a word, Jasper moved. Each heavy step was deliberate, unyielding, carrying the weight of the silent peaks. He did not rush, but advanced with the slow, inevitable momentum of a glacier. The crowd, which moments before had been a chorus of whispers and pointing fingers, fell into an uneasy silence, parting before him like startled deer. His shadow, long and imposing in the weak winter sun, fell over Ilara, shielding her from the harsh glare of judgment. He stood between her and the merchant, a formidable barrier of sinew and spirit, his broad back to the trembling woman, his face a craggy mask of ancient disapproval turned towards the accusers. The scent of wood smoke, pine needles, and something wild and elemental clung to him, a stark contrast to the stale, dusty air of the town. The merchant, initially emboldened by the crowd, found his voice faltering under Jasper's unwavering stare. He attempted to reiterate his complaint, his words losing their conviction in the chilling silence that followed the mountain man's arrival. But Jasper did not engage in argument or debate. His voice, when it finally broke the hush, was not loud, but deep and resonant, like the rumble of distant thunder echoing off granite cliffs. It carried the undeniable authority of a force of nature, a decree carved into the very rock of the earth. He declared that no one, under his watch, would ever face such hunger again. It was a promise forged in the unforgiving crucible of the wilderness, a law immutable and profound, spoken not as a man of the town, but as a guardian of something far greater. From a worn deerskin pouch at his belt, he produced a small, glinting nugget of raw gold, dull with the earth but radiating a rich, undeniable value. He dropped it into the merchant's outstretched, bewildered hand. The gold, heavy and pure, was worth more than a wagon load of rotten apples, more even than the entire paltry harvest of that greedy man's store. It was an act of profound, almost defiant generosity, an offering that silenced all further protests and rendered the merchant's petty complaints utterly meaningless. It was a stark reminder that true wealth was not measured in accumulation, but in the capacity for life, for dignity. Then Jasper turned his gaze back to Ilara, his hand, large and calloused but steady and without menace, extended towards her. It was an offer not of charity but of sanctuary. He spoke again, his voice softer now, yet still imbued with that deep resonance, inviting her and her children to his domain in the high mountains. It was an invitation not just to escape the immediate hunger, but to flee the very spirit of cruelty that festered in Havenwood. Ilara, who had known only rejection, and the chilling abandonment of society since her husband's death, stared at his outstretched hand. The mountain, which had always seemed a formidable, unyielding wall of stone and ice, now shimmered with the faint, elusive promise of refuge. Her heart, which had been a drum of despair, now fluttered with a confused, desperate hope. To remain in Havenwood was to continue to wither under the icy gaze of judgment, to watch her children fade. To go with this mountain giant, this stranger, was to step into the vast, unknown maw of the wilderness, a place she had only ever seen from a fearful distance. Yet the mountain man's eyes held no judgment, only a deep, quiet understanding. The town had offered her nothing but scorn. He offered a chance at life. The choice, though terrifying, was clear. She nodded, a silent, desperate affirmation, clutching her children closer. The path before them was shrouded in mist and uncertainty, a winding ascent away from the false warmth of civilization and into the rugged, honest heart of the untamed peaks, where a different kind of life, and perhaps a different kind of redemption, awaited. The last thing she saw of Havenwood was the collective frozen shock on the faces of its inhabitants, already fading into a distant, unforgettable past. The journey to Jasper's isolated cabin was a profound passage, a physical ascent that mirrored an internal one. Leaving the small, accusing square of Havenwood behind, Ilara and her children followed the towering figure of the mountain man as he led them away from the valley's stifling judgment and into the vast, ancient embrace of the mountains. Each step upward was a conscious severance from the false comfort of what she had known, a surrender to the unknown. The familiar biting wind of Havenwood gave way to the crisp, clean air of the higher elevations, carrying the sharp, invigorating scent of pine and frozen earth. The world around them transformed from familiar, if hostile civilization, into an untamed canvas of towering evergreens, silent, snow-dusted slopes, and the endless, watchful sky. Ilara carried her youngest, a silent, bundled weight against her chest, while her older child clung to her skirts, eyes wide with a mix of fear and wonder. Jasper moved with an effortless grace that belied his massive size, his gait sure-footed on the icy paths, as if the very mountains recognized him as their own. He spoke little, yet his silence was not an absence, but a presence, a quiet strength that seemed to guide them through the deepening wilderness. Occasionally he would stop, pointing out a track in the snow, a distant hawk circling, or a specific tree whose bark held a certain resilience. He was not just walking through the landscape, he was intimately a part of it, reading its every subtle language. As dusk began to paint the sky in hues of violet and gray, the cabin finally emerged from the deepening shadows. It was not the crude, ramshackle dwelling Ilara had half expected, but a sturdy structure of hand-hewn logs. Nestled precisely against a sheltering rock face, smoke curled lazily from its stone chimney, a beacon of unexpected warmth in the vast, cold expanse. The interior, when Jasper opened the heavy fur-lined door, was a revelation. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, its roaring fire casting a golden dancing light across the room. The air was thick with the comforting sense of burning pine, dried herbs, and something savory cooking, a stark contrast to the sterile chill of the outside world and the hollow ache in Ilara's stomach. Inside, the space was small but meticulously kept, a testament to Jasper's quiet order. Tools hung neatly on walls, furs were draped over sturdy benches, and a rough-hewn table held a simple, steaming meal. Ilara's initial awe was quickly replaced by a wave of trepidation. She was a refugee in the domain of a solitary man, a keeper of the wilderness. The stark contrast between their lives, their worlds, was immense. He was a pillar of self-sufficiency. She was a vessel of need. Her apprehension was palpable, a quiet tension in the small, warm space. She felt like an intruder, a fragile bird blown off course into a hawk's nest. Jasper, sensing her unease, moved with a quiet purpose, his large hands carefully tending the fire, stirring a pot of stew. He did not offer empty assurances, but instead provided concrete, immediate comforts. He gestured towards a corner where thick furs lay piled on a makeshift bed, a silent invitation to rest. Though his voice remained low, his actions spoke volumes. He was a reclusive man, his life finely tuned to the rhythms of the mountain, a life of solitude, purpose, and self-reliance. His world was one of carefully maintained boundaries, and now 2 children and a weary woman had irrevocably crossed them. His eyes, when they met hers, held a complex mix of wariness and a deeper, unspoken understanding. He was not a man given to grand gestures or flowery words, but his silent acceptance, his provision of warmth and food, was more profound than any elaborate welcome. He had offered sanctuary, and now it was upon her to prove she was worthy of it, not through words, but through her own actions and resilience. He had lived alone for so long, crafting a life in stark independence, and the intrusion of others into his carefully constructed solitude was a significant shift. There was an unspoken question in the air, a condition woven into the very fabric of their new, fragile arrangement. As the children, lulled by the warmth and the unfamiliar scent of safety, finally drifted into a deep, peaceful sleep, Elara realized the full weight of her new reality. The mountain man was offering more than just shelter. He was offering a chance at a new beginning, far removed from the petty cruelties of Havenwood. But nothing in the mountains came without a price, without effort. She knew, with a certainty as cold and clear as the mountain air, that his sanctuary came with an unspoken understanding. It would not be a place of idle comfort, but a haven earned through effort, through usefulness, through a deep and abiding respect for the wild laws that governed his solitary world. The mountain demanded work, and she, a woman with nothing left to lose, would give it everything she had. The first days in Jasper's cabin were a test of endurance, a silent trial by fire and ice. Elara, accustomed to the confined spaces and social intricacies of town life, found herself thrust into a raw, primal existence where every task was essential, every action had consequence. The sheer physicality of the mountain life was a revelation. She learned to split kindling with an axe, her soft hands blistering, then hardening. She carried heavy buckets of water from a nearby spring, navigating treacherous snow-covered paths. The rhythmic thud of the axe on wood, the crunch of snow underfoot, the roar of the fire. These became the new soundtrack to her days, replacing the distant chatter of Havenwood. Jasper, true to his nature, observed more than he instructed. He taught by example, his movements economical and precise, his expectations clear through his silent efficiency. Initially, her efforts were clumsy, born more of desperate necessity than skill, but Elara possessed a quiet tenacity, a deep well of resilience honed by years of hardship. She watched Jasper, absorbing his methods, learning the subtle ways of mountain living. She learned to identify edible roots and berries, even in winter's scarcity, from his brief pointing gestures. She discovered the medicinal properties of certain barks and leaves, remedies for coughs and fevers, knowledge he shared not with words, but by laying a cluster of dried herbs on the table for her to examine. Her hands, once soft, grew calloused and strong, her movements more confident. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to find her footing in this austere, demanding world. What Jasper hadn't accounted for, what the mountain man, accustomed to solitude, had overlooked, was the profound, almost alchemical effect Elara's presence had on his dwelling. His cabin, once merely a place of survival, a shelter against the elements, a workshop for traps and tools, began to subtly transform. Her small, tender gestures wove a new kind of warmth into the rough-hewn logs. She used the few herbs Jasper provided not just for medicine, but to season their sparse meals, coaxing flavor from venison and wild vegetables. She mended their tattered clothes with precise stitches, her nimble fingers working wonders with needle and thread, a skill that earned a flicker of surprise in Jasper's usually impassive eyes. One crisp morning, as the sun began to warm the cabin's single window, Jasper watched her from the corner of his eye. Elara had taken to sweeping the dirt floor each day, not merely to clear debris, but to bring a sense of order, a touch of human care to the raw earth. She had fashioned a crude yet beautiful centerpiece for their table, from dried mountain flora she had carefully collected. The space, which had always been functional, now held a faint, comforting echo of a home. It was no longer just his solitary refuge. It was becoming a place where life, even in its harshest form, could truly flourish. The children, once silent and withdrawn, now played quietly by the hearth, their laughter a soft melody that sometimes escaped, a sound that had been utterly absent from Jasper's life for many years. This quiet domesticity, this unexpected blossoming of warmth, was more than just a convenience for Jasper. It was a subtle, yet profound challenge to his long-held belief that solitude was his only path. Ilara's gentle touch was healing not just the cabin, but the wounds of his own reclusive heart. Wounds he hadn't even realized were still bleeding. Her quiet competence was gaining his respect, and perhaps a deeper, more complicated emotion he had long since buried. He had taken her in for reasons of principle, out of a raw, almost instinctual sense of right, but she was slowly, irrevocably, becoming more than just a refugee. But the mountain, relentless in its lessons, never allowed for prolonged comfort. One day, a fierce blizzard, unlike any Ilara had yet witnessed, descended without warning. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the cabin's sturdy frame, threatening to bury it under feet of snow. The fire, their sole source of warmth, began to dwindle as their carefully hoarded supply of dry wood rapidly diminished. The children coughed, their small bodies shivering despite the layers of furs. Ilara looked at the dwindling flames, then at Jasper, his face etched with grim determination as he prepared to brave the storm for more wood. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced her heart. She understood then with a terrible clarity that their small, fragile peace was always at the mercy of the wild, and that the mountain's tests were far from over. This storm was not just a challenge to their survival. It was a brutal interruption to the quiet healing that had begun, a reminder that the wild could be both a sanctuary and a merciless adversary. The blizzard raged with a primal fury, transforming the world outside into a swirling vortex of white, a relentless assault on the cabin's fragile sanctuary. The wind howled through every crack and crevice, a mournful lament that spoke of untamed power. Inside, the dwindling fire was a flickering heart against the encroaching cold. The children, their faces pale and drawn, shivered beneath heavy blankets, their small coughs echoing in the strained silence. Ilara watched Jasper, his face a canvas of grim resolve, as he prepared to venture into the storm. His decision to seek more wood, a necessity to keep them from freezing, was a stark testament to the desperate straits they were in. The mountain man, usually so self-sufficient, now faced a challenge that even his immense strength might not overcome. Ilara knew the risks. To step outside meant battling blinding snow, freezing temperatures, and the very real threat of becoming disoriented and lost forever in the white abyss. Her heart pounded with a desperate fear, a protective instinct that surged through her like a fierce current. She looked at her children, then at the stoic figure of Jasper, and a new kind of resolve solidified within her. She might not possess his brute strength, but she had a keen eye for detail, a quiet resourcefulness born of a life spent observing, making do, and finding hidden pathways. She recalled how Jasper often spoke of certain trees, their unique resilience, their locations often marked by subtle signs invisible to the untrained eye. Suddenly, a memory surfaced, sharp and clear. Just days earlier, while gathering water, she had noticed a cluster of deadfall near a massive granite outcropping, sheltered somewhat from the worst winds. Jasper had briefly mentioned it, noting its strategic position for firewood, but had dismissed it as not yet needed. It was a perilous trek, but potentially less exposed than venturing deeper into the open forest. She turned to Jasper, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She explained what she had seen, describing the location with a precision that surprised him. Her knowledge, seemingly insignificant days ago, now offered a glimmer of hope in the face of despair. Jasper listened, his piercing gaze assessing her words, weighing the slight advantage her insight offered against the immense danger of the storm. He knew the spot she spoke of, a small, natural alcove in the relentless onslaught of the wind. With a curt nod, a silent acknowledgement of her unexpected contribution, he geared himself. Together, they battled their way outside, Ilara holding a lantern high, its feeble light a struggling beacon in the suffocating whiteout, guiding him through the swirling snow. Each step was a struggle, the wind tearing at their clothes, the cold biting at their exposed skin. But Ilara pushed on, her determination burning brighter than the lantern flame. She moved not with brute force, but with a surprising agility, her small frame navigating the drifts, her eyes fixed on the vague outline of the outcropping. When they finally reached the sheltered alcove, it was as she remembered. A trove of fallen branches, relatively dry and protected. Working in a furious silence, their breath frosting in the frigid air, they gathered as much wood as they could carry, their movements a synchronized dance of desperate survival. The task was harrowing, each swing of the axe a battle against the elements, but the thought of the children's cold faces spurred them on. Returning to the cabin, laden with their precious cargo, they collapsed by the roaring fire, their bodies aching, their lungs burning. The children, seeing the new wood, managed weak smiles, their small hands reaching for the warmth. As the blizzard began to relent, its fury slowly giving way to a hushed, snow-laden calm, Ilara and Jasper sat by the hearth, the children finally sleeping soundly. The air was thick with the scent of pine and sweat, and the quiet crackle of the fire. The shared ordeal had stripped away the last vestiges of their initial guardedness. Their eyes met, and in that silent gaze, a profound understanding passed between them. Jasper, the stoic recluse, saw not just a resourceful woman, but a kindred spirit, a survivor whose resilience mirrored his own. He spoke, his voice low and raspy from the cold, of his own loss, of the pain that had driven him to the solitude of the mountains, a wound he had carried for years, believing it too deep to ever heal. He spoke of a family lost to sickness, of a grief so profound it had exiled him from humanity. Ilara, in turn, confessed her own raw wounds, the sudden, brutal loss of her husband, the cold, isolating judgment of Havenwood, the fear of failing her children. She spoke of the shame she had felt, the profound sense of abandonment. The truth, raw and unvarnished, hung in the air between them, not as a burden, but as a bridge. They were two outcasts, both marked by loss, both seeking refuge from a world that had betrayed them. The shocking truth was not an external secret, but the revelation of their shared vulnerability, their brokenness, and the quiet strength that had allowed them to endure. In that moment, by the dancing firelight, their partnership was sealed, not in words, but in the silent communion of two scarred souls finding solace in each other's presence. The mountain had witnessed their isolation, and now it witnessed their forging of a new, unexpected bond, a fragile promise of shared burdens and nascent hope. As the last echoes of the blizzard faded, leaving behind a world hushed and sparkling with fresh snow, a new rhythm settled into the cabin. The shared ordeal had forged an undeniable bond between Ilara and Jasper, a silent understanding born from facing the mountain's fury together. The previous tension, the guardedness of two wary strangers, dissolved into a quiet, almost domestic partnership. Days now unfolded with a comforting predictability. Jasper would rise with the sun, venturing out to check his traps or hunt for game, his massive frame blending seamlessly with the forest. Ilara, in turn, managed the cabin, a silent orchestrator of warmth and order. She transformed their meals from mere sustenance into something more nourishing, infusing them with her simple herbal knowledge and a touch of care. She kept the fire burning bright, its constant glow a heart in the wilderness. The children, once timid shadows, now flourished under her gentle guidance, their laughter, once rare, echoing more frequently within the cabin walls. Jasper, upon his return, would find the cabin warm, the stew simmering and the children often sketching crude figures with charcoal on bits of bark. He would observe them, his gaze softening, a subtle shift in his usually stern demeanor. The cabin was no longer a solitary outpost, but a bustling, living space, imbued with the soft hum of shared life. They often sat together by the fire in the evenings, the deep silence of the mountain occasionally punctuated by the crackle of burning wood or the distant cry of a nocturnal animal. Ilara would mend clothes, her fingers nimble and quick, while Jasper would clean his rifle or sharpen his axe. It was in these quiet moments that their connection deepened, built not on words but on shared tasks, mutual respect, and the unspoken acknowledgement of their past pains. He found comfort in her quiet strength, in the peaceful presence she brought to his once empty life. She found solace in his steadfastness, his unwavering protection, and the simple honesty of his existence. The fear that had once defined her was slowly replaced by a sense of belonging, a profound peace she had not known since before her husband's death. One evening, as Ilara sorted through a small, forgotten box of her late husband's few belongings, she found a tarnished silver locket. It was an old family heirloom, one she rarely wore. She opened it, revealing a faded miniature portrait of her husband, but beneath that, a smaller, almost hidden engraving. It depicted a solitary peak, rugged and distinctive, with a symbol she recognized as a specific rare mountain flower, one that only bloomed in the highest, most secluded crevices of Jasper's own territory. It was a detail her husband had never spoken of, a secret history etched into his family's past. A flicker of recognition sparked within her. Her husband's family, long ago, had been mountain folk before settling in the valley. They were known for their unique knowledge of certain medicinal herbs and rare plants, precisely the kind Jasper occasionally sought. The locket was not just a memento, it was a silent testament to a connection she had never known, a whisper from the past suggesting that their paths, Ilara's and Jasper's, were perhaps always destined to intertwine. It suggested that her husband's family, distant generations ago, had lived in these very mountains, gathering the same herbs, perhaps even knowing Jasper's own ancestors. Their meeting, far from being a random act of fate, felt now like the slow unfurling of a long-written saga, a predestined gathering of two souls whose roots ran deeper than either had ever imagined. But the peace of the mountain, like the shifting snows, could be fleeting. One particularly clear morning, as Jasper returned from checking his trap lines, a strange unease hung in the air. The usual crisp silence was broken by something unnatural, a faint, metallic clang carried on the wind from the valley below. He found a small, roughly carved wooden figurine propped against the cabin door, a crude representation of a woman. It was not a message of goodwill. Nailed to its chest was a strip of cloth, a familiar distinctive weave that Ilara recognized instantly. It was from a dress she had left behind in Havenwood, a garment her husband had given her. It was a clear, undeniable sign that her past, the very past she had desperately fled, had not forgotten her. The town, or someone from it, had found them. The fragile peace of their new life was about to be shattered, and the wild sanctuary they had built was now threatened by the encroaching shadows of the world below. The small wooden figurine, coupled with the scrap of cloth from Ilara's old dress, was a chilling declaration. It was not a message of welcome, but a mark of insidious ownership, a silent yet menacing promise that the past, like a predator, had tracked its prey to the sanctuary of the high mountains. The fragile calm that had settled over their lives was violently ripped apart. Ilara's heart pounded with a renewed terror, a cold, familiar dread that gripped her tighter than any winter chill. She had fled Havenwood, believing the immense silent peaks would swallow her whole, erasing her from the memory of those who judged and condemned. Yet here was undeniable proof that their reach extended even into Jasper's secluded domain. Jasper's response was immediate and primal. The quiet, almost gentle man who had shared his fire and his life with her transformed. The mountain man re-emerged, his senses heightened, his movements charged with a fierce, protective energy. He examined the figurine, his eyes scanning the surrounding woods with the intensity of a seasoned hunter. The message was clear. Someone from Havenwood, likely the merchant or a proxy, had discovered their refuge. They viewed Ilara not as a woman seeking peace, but as property, a debt unpaid, a reputation sullied, or perhaps a convenient tool for their own dark purposes. The initial pursuit for the stolen apples now seemed a shallow pretext for a deeper, more insidious agenda. They sought to reclaim what they felt they owned, to drag her back into their world of petty judgments and control. For days, the air around the cabin crackled with an unspoken tension. Jasper became even more vigilant, his rifle always within reach, his gaze constantly sweeping the perimeter. He taught Ilara the subtle art of reading the forest, pointing out broken twigs, disturbed snow, the faint scent of foreign smoke, all signs of intrusion. She, in turn, remembered the old pathways, the hidden game trails her husband had once spoken of, knowledge that now became crucial in anticipating an approach. The children, sensing the shift, became quieter, their play subdued, their eyes often seeking the reassuring presence of either Ilara or Jasper. The mountain, which had once felt like a welcoming embrace, now seemed to hold its breath, a silent witness to the impending confrontation. The true nature of the threat soon revealed itself, more complex and insidious than they had initially feared. It wasn't just the merchant seeking retribution. Whispers had reached them through one of Jasper's rare, trusted contacts, an old trapper who occasionally ventured into the foothills. The merchant, it seemed, was merely a pawn, a shadowy figure from a distant, larger town, a land speculator with ambitions to acquire the valuable mining rights to Havenwood's surrounding mountains, had seen Ilara's public humiliation as an opportunity. He had offered the merchant a significant sum for information leading to the recovery of stolen goods and a runaway woman, spinning a narrative of Ilara as a fugitive and of Jasper as her accomplice. The figurine and cloth were not just a reminder, but a calculated warning from this unseen enemy, a psychological game to unnerve them before the final strike. The speculator wanted to destabilize the region, to force out any independent spirits like Jasper, paving the way for his own corporate interests. Ilara's flight and Jasper's subsequent intervention had inadvertently made them both targets. The threat was no longer a simple matter of a wronged merchant. It was a powerful, unseen hand manipulating events, seeing the mountain sanctuary as an obstacle to profit. The valley, it seemed, was extending its greedy grasp, threatening to consume the last bastions of wild independence. One biting afternoon, faint but distinct, the sound of voices and the snapping of twigs echoed from the lower slopes. They were coming, several men judging by the noise, armed and determined. Jasper looked at Ilara, his eyes a steel-hard blue, a silent promise of protection. He knew his cabin, his home was strong, but he was one man against what sounded like many. They could lay siege or worse, put the children in harm's way. A terrible choice loomed. Ilara, her mind racing, saw the fear in her children's eyes, heard the distant encroaching sounds. She thought of her husband, of her past, of the fresh grave in the valley. She thought of the life they had forged here, the warmth, the dignity, the family they had become. Then a chilling clarity settled over her. She knew the layout of the old mining trails from her husband's tales, the less used paths around the back of the mountains, forgotten by most. She knew a way to distract them, to lure them away, to gain precious time for Jasper and her children to escape deeper into the uncharted, impassable higher peaks. It was a perilous, almost certainly fatal gambit, but it was the only path she saw to truly save them all. With a quiet, resolute breath, she made her decision. Her eyes met Jasper's, a silent message passing between them, a desperate plan already forming. She would leave, drawing the pursuit away from the cabin, towards a narrow, dangerous pass, a place of no return. For the sake of the life they had built, for the small, fragile family she had found, Ilara prepared to step back into the jaws of the wolf, sacrificing herself for the survival of those she loved. Ilara's resolve was a steel-hard core beneath her fear. As the voices grew louder, she moved with a desperate urgency, instructing Jasper on the obscure, treacherous mountain passes she knew her husband had sometimes used, routes too dangerous for regular travel, but perfect for escape. Her children, their faces tear-streaked, clung to Jasper's legs, their small hands conveying a silent, desperate plea. He understood her plan. The look in her eyes, the quiet determination needed no words. He knew the risk she was taking, the immense sacrifice she intended. With a heavy heart and a fierce protective snarl that rumbled deep in his chest, he nodded, a silent promise to protect the children with his life. Leaving a small, distinct trail of her footprints leading away from the cabin in the opposite direction of the children's escape, Alara vanished into the swirling snow. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her mind was clear. She climbed higher, knowing the pursuers, driven by greed and the speculator's bounty, would follow the easiest tracks. Her chosen path led towards the treacherous Widow's Notch, a narrow, ice-slicked pass known for its sudden rockfalls and dizzying drops. It was a place where only the most desperate or the most foolish would venture. Her aim was not to outrun them, but to lure them into a trap, to use the mountain itself as her ally. The pursuit was swift and brutal. She heard their shouts, the heavy crunch of their boots on the snow growing closer. The leader, a burly, cold-eyed man sent by the speculator, taunted her with promises of a harsh return to Havenwood, of justice for her perceived crimes. But Alara did not break. She pushed on, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming, her mind focused solely on her objective. She knew the pass held a delicate balance, a precarious overhang of ice and loose rock, vulnerable to vibration. She had to lead them there, into the mountain's unforgiving embrace. Just as their grasping hands were almost upon her, Alara rounded a final bend, revealing the treacherous chasm of Widow's Notch. She scrambled onto a small, stable ledge, her heart in her throat, and faced her pursuers. The leader, confident in his capture, smirked, ready to seize her, but Alara did not cower. Instead, she used her final breath for a desperate act. She threw a handful of small, sharp stones at a visible weakness in the ice overhang above them, a spot she had marked with her eyes moments before. It was a desperate gamble, a quiet defiance that leveraged the very power of the wild against its invaders. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The subtle vibrations, amplified by the wind and the unstable nature of the ice, triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. A deep, guttural groan echoed through the pass as the massive overhang fractured, then gave way with a thunderous roar. Ice and rock plummeted down, a deadly avalanche that swallowed the men whole. There were no screams, only the deafening roar of the mountain reclaiming its own, a chilling silence following the cascade of destruction. Alara watched, numb with terror and grim satisfaction as the chasm sealed itself, a tomb for her pursuers. Yet a single figure, nimble and quick, had managed to scramble back, just barely escaping the full force of the rockfall. It was the brutish leader, now bruised and battered, his face contorted with a hatred far deeper than before. He lunged at Alara, driven by a primal need for vengeance, his eyes alight with murderous intent. But just as his hands reached for her, a blur of fur and muscle erupted from the snow-covered trees above. Jasper, having secreted the children away in a hidden cave known only to him, had doubled back, following Alara's trail, sensing the direness of her sacrifice. He moved with the speed and ferocity of a cornered bear, his raw strength overwhelming the man. There was no mercy in Jasper's movements, only a protective fury. He disarmed the leader with a brutal efficiency, his actions swift and decisive. The man, a pawn of the speculator, was no match for the true, untamed power of the mountain. Jasper did not kill him. Instead, with a chilling intensity that left no doubt of his warning, he dragged the unconscious man to the edge of the newly formed chasm, placing him within sight of the frozen tomb of his companions. He left him there, stripped of his weapons and his pride, to awaken to the chilling reality of his defeat, to the cold, unforgiving justice of the mountain. It was a message to all who dared to trespass, a testament to the brutal, beautiful laws of the wild. the threat was neutralized, not just by strength, but by the raw, unyielding power of the land itself, and the unbreakable bond of those who sought to protect it. The snow, falling softly now, began to cover the scars, slowly erasing the evidence of the violent confrontation. The confrontation at Widow's Notch had left an indelible mark, a stark reminder of the world's enduring cruelty, but also of the fierce, unyielding power of love and protection. The mountain had witnessed the battle, and it had claimed its due. In the aftermath, the silence of the peaks felt different, not empty, but resonant with a profound sense of peace, hard-won and deeply cherished. Jasper and Alara, returning to the cabin, found a new depth in their quiet understanding, a bond forged in fire and ice, unbreakable. 9 months later, the cabin was a place utterly transformed. It was no longer a survival outpost, but a vibrant, living home, a beacon of warmth against the vast wilderness. The scent of pine and wood smoke mingled with the sweet aroma of baking bread and dried herbs. Alara, now heavy with child, moved with a gentle grace, her previous weariness replaced by a quiet contentment. Her children, once pale and withdrawn, were now robust and full of laughter, their eyes bright with the joy of a secure childhood. They helped Jasper with chores, learning the ways of the mountain with an eagerness that filled his once solitary world with light. Jasper, the formidable mountain man, was no longer a recluse defined by loss. His gruff exterior had softened, replaced by a quiet tenderness, especially when he looked at Alara, or when the children tugged at his furs, seeking his attention. The cabin, once filled with the echoes of his solitude, now hummed with the joyful chaos of a true family. He had built a small, sturdy cradle from freshly cut timber, his large hands working with an unexpected delicacy. The arrival of their first child, a healthy, strong boy with Alara's gentle eyes and Jasper's powerful build, was a moment of profound, wordless celebration. He was named Silas after the strength of the mountain itself, a symbol of their new beginning, a legacy born of courage and sacrifice. In the quiet months that followed, as Alara held their infant son, she made a startling discovery. Amongst her husband's old, tattered maps, she found hidden markings, not of mine shafts or gold veins, but of ancient burial grounds and sacred springs high in the uncharted mountains. It was a secret known only to a few, passed down through generations of mountain families. These places, marked with symbols she now recognized from her husband's locket, were not for plunder, but for reverence. Her husband's lineage, she realized, was not just from the valley, but deeply rooted in these very peaks, a connection to the mountain spirit that ran back further than she had ever imagined. The locket had been a key to her past, linking her directly to the untamed heart of this land, making her not merely a refugee, but a true daughter of the mountains, her destiny intertwined with Jasper's and with the very essence of their sanctuary. The story of the mountain man and the widow, of their defiance against the town's greed and the speculator's ambition, began to travel through the remote valleys and passes. It became a legend whispered around campfires, a tale of how true wealth lay not in gold, but in courage, in compassion, and in the bonds forged between outcasts. The merciless speculator, shamed by his failed endeavor and the loss of his men, retreated, his ambitions thwarted by the unyielding spirit of the mountains and the strength of a family he could not break. Havenwood, humbled by the mountain man's silent rebuke, slowly began to reconsider its own values, its coldness giving way, perhaps, to a grudging respect for the wild, untamed justice of the peaks. And so, high in the remote fastness of the mountains, a new kind of kingdom flourished. It was not one built on gold or power, but on resilience, on mutual respect, and on the profound understanding that family was not always born of blood, but of shared struggle, of protection, and of unconditional love. Alara and Jasper, with their children, had not just found a refuge, they had built a legacy. Their home was a testament to the enduring truth that the truest strength lies not in conquering the wild, but in living in harmony with it. The mountain, a silent ancient witness, had given them its solitude, its challenges, and ultimately, its greatest gift. A place where two souls, once broken and alone, could finally find healing, purpose, and a home, not just within its formidable embrace, but within each other's hearts. For in the vastness of the untamed world, the most profound sanctuary is always found in the quiet, unwavering promise of belonging. Did you enjoy this journey? Tell us from what corner of the world you're watching this story from. Leave your comment, and to make sure you don't miss the next adventure, subscribe to the channel.